Now, though, it had a purpose. Margie's project waited for her in Jake's little cabinet, which was only a few feet from Jake's bed. Just behind and to the left of the ugly green plaid chair. Although she could take her project out of the cabinet and work on it in her room, it never seemed right to do that. Her project lived in the little cabinet. Moving it felt wrong. Jake let out a deep sigh in his sleep, and Margie froze with her hand on the cabinet door. She breathed in and out, saddened by the astringent medicinal smells in the room. When Jake didn't move again, she grasped the doorknob and slowly pulled the door open. She waited to be sure Jake was still sleeping deeply. Then she turned to the headlamp she wore. It was designed for crafters who wanted to see up close, and it suited Margie's needs perfectly. It allowed her to aim a small beam at her task without lighting up too much of the room. Jake usually slept hard, so there was little chance she'd wake him. But she didn't want to take chances. In the glow of her headlamp, Margie's project looked at her with its simple hand-drawn eyes, one of which was blackened. "Hi, cutie," Margie whispered. Margie's project didn't respond. This was a good thing. Margie's project was a doll. If it had responded to her, she'd have shot up, whacked her head, and run for her life. This doll was Evan's brainchild. Almost 3 feet high, plain white, at least originally, and now covered in evidence of the adventures Jake was having in his mind with Simon. Margie's project was an exercise of hope. Or maybe even more than hope. It was an exercise in belief. If you were to infuse an object with enough love and intention, would it have life? Evan apparently thought so, and Margie did too now. The white doll sitting in front of Margie was such an object. Born as simply a white cloth doll with no face, no clothing, and no features or hidden detail of any kind, this doll now embodied the life of a healthy version of Jake. Weeks of real Jake experiences were drawn all over the doll. The blackened eye, for example, represented the day the real Jake stood up to a school bully. A drawn-on missing lower tooth represented the day the real Jake tried a tough trick with a skateboard. The doll's pockets were overflowing with drawings of tickets to movies and amusement parks and zoos. The doll's body was stained with the trials and tribulations of a joyful child's life. This doll was a reminder that the boy in question, although fading, was not gone yet. He still had enough imagination to conjure another adventure. Margie set a zipper bag of colored markers on the green carpeted floor and pulled a piece of paper from her jean pocket. The paper held all the activities the real Jake had done over the previous 3 days. When Jake talked to Simon, Margie took notes. Laying the paper on the floor next to the zipper bag, Margie pulled a thick brown marker from the bag. Nearly every detail on the doll had started with this marker. Sometimes, though, Margie needed to add a color, like now, putting a check mark next to butter on her list. Margie chose a pale yellow marker, too. Concentrating, she drew a butter stain around the doll's mouth. Then, she traded the pale yellow marker for the thick brown one and sketched part of a popcorn kernel between 2 teeth. It looked pretty realistic if she did say so herself. She knew her art degree would be good for something. Maybe she was missing her calling. She should have been a real kid doll decorator. Margie grinned and looked at her list. Ah, the splinter. Although Margie usually drew her additions to the doll, sometimes she used props. Like today, reaching in her pocket, Margie pulled out a little plastic bag. Inside the bag were 2 splinters. One was maybe a ½ inch long. The other wasn't much more than a speck. She put one of the splinters on the pad of the doll's index finger, and she put the other splinter on the very tip of the doll's middle finger. Margie looked at her list again. She checked off popcorn and splinters, and she moved on to pizza sauce. The doll already had his pizza sauce stain on his chin. Margie added another one at the corner of its mouth, then rubbed a little garlic powder into the white cloth. She liked adding scents for realism when she could, like the chocolate stain from a few nights ago. She'd use real chocolate for that, so the doll smelled chocolatey sweet. Satisfied with the pizza stain, she moved on to the rainbow colors of finger paints under the nails. That was fun. She put a different color at the end of every one of the doll's fingers. Then, using a black marker, she drew arcade tickets coming out of the doll's pocket, and once again, She used a prop when she glued a smiley face eraser to the doll's hand. She thought that little tidbit was so important that she sent Jillian's daughter, Patty, to an arcade to win an eraser for her. It only cost Margie $5 worth of quarters to get it. After she attached the eraser, she gave the doll a small tongue, and she colored purple stains on it. Then she studied the doll's feet. She never thought she'd draw shoes on the doll. But if she was going to draw a broken shoelace, there had to be shoes. So for the next several minutes, Margie bent over the doll's feet and drew green tennis shoes. Green was Jake's favorite color, and besides, green went with the grass stains on the doll's knees. The doll had a lot going on in the knee area. In addition to the grass stains, the knees had reddish scrapes and various hues of brown smudges from sliding into base on the dirt and mud. When Margie finished her work for the night, she sat back and studied the doll. It was turning into a hot mess with all the details she kept adding. But she knew that when Jake got to see it, he'd love it. It was intended to be a surprise for when he was well again. When he could walk, he'd go to the cabinet, open the door, find the doll, and he'd see all the things real Jake did while sick Jake concentrated on getting well. Margie ignored the sharp twist in her intestines when she thought about Jake getting well. It was her inner compass telling her that Jake's recovery was by no means something Margie could expect. In fact, it was becoming less of a possibility every day. Stop it. Margie scolded herself in a whisper. He's going to be fine. She gathered her materials and stood. She made sure she closed the cabinet door before tiptoeing out of the room. Jake tried to concentrate on totaling up the rent money he owed Margie for landing on her hotel-heavy property. He was having trouble counting the gazillion hotels she had. Mostly because he was struggling to figure out which were the real hotels and which were the echo hotels. He had the same issue with the money. Which was the real money and which was the echo money? Of course there was no real money, but Jake wished he could at least be sure about what was part of this world and what was being manufactured by his pine nut. Well, no, that wasn't exactly right. His pine nut didn't make the echoes. Jake concentrated on remembering what Dr. Betterman had told him. Right. Dr. Betterman had said that because Jake's tumor was close to the nuclei that were in charge of the eye movements, the tumor pushed in places where it shouldn't. So it was the nuclei that made Jake see double. Jake had to look up nuclei to understand what Dr. Betterman was saying. He found out that nuclei was the plural form of nucleus. So he looked up nucleus. And he discovered that a nucleus was a little group of neurons in the central nervous system. Of course, then he had to look up neurons and central nervous system. He found out that a nucleus was a nerve cell, an electrically excitable cell. That made him laugh. He could imagine a little cell plugging into electricity and dancing all around like crazy. The central nervous system, he learned, was the combination of the brain and spine and all the nerves that made it so that humans could move and think and feel. So basically, this little group of excitable cells was getting too crazy. And while they were partying, they were bothering Jake's eye cells. Seemed kind of rude to him, and he wished his nuclei would calm down. He was tired of seeing double. Jake returned his attention to counting, but he realized he'd made a mistake. He had to start over. He didn't want to start over. Grunting, Jake reached out and flipped the game board off his bed, sending fake money and echoes of fake money flying through the air, along with houses, hotels, and little playing pieces. The tiny dog almost hit Margie in the eye, and she said, "Hey!" Jake immediately felt bad, but then he was angry that he felt bad, so he screamed. He screamed at the top of his lungs, and Margie didn't stop him. All she did was get up and step over to close his bedroom window. The closing window did stop him, though. "Why do you close it? Are you afraid people will think you're murdering me?" Margie looked at him and rolled her eyes. "As if, kiddo. If I wanted to, I could end you so quickly you'd never make a sound." Jake's eyes got big, and Margie erupted into a clumsy ninja pose. She shouted, "Ah-ya!" and pretended to kick toward Jake's bed. That made him laugh. When Margie dropped her foot, stepped on another game piece, and started hopping around the room, Jake laughed even harder. "Sure, mock my pain," she said. Jake kept laughing. Margie stopped hopping around and went back to the window. It's hot in here. Who closed the window? Jake giggled. You did. Oh, I did? Yeah. I'll take your word for it. Margie began cleaning up the game. I assume you're done with this one for now? She asked, as if it was normal to throw a tantrum over some stupid board game. I'm sorry, Jake said. I got frustrated. No, Margie said in pretended disbelief. You don't say. I just figured your wires got crossed or your circuits were frying. Jake laughed again. Margie grinned at him and returned to picking up fake money, game pieces, and tiny hotels and houses. I love you, Margie, Jake said. Margie stopped moving. She was bent over. Her face turned away from Jake. It took a couple of seconds, but she finally straightened and looked at him. Her eyes were moist. I love you too, Jake. Margie sat on the front porch swinging in the dark. She'd finished her daily project. Jake was sleeping restlessly. She had the baby monitor in her pocket as usual. It was too hot in her little room to sleep. She tried sleeping on the sofa, but her thoughts wouldn't turn off. So here she was, using her foot to rock herself back and forth in hopes that the soothing motion would relax her. The sky was filled with stars, muted somewhat by the city lights in the distance. A couple fireflies darted in and out of the drooping boxwood at the corner of the house. The sound of oldies music and a TV show with a lot of shooting wafted across the street from open windows. The air smelled dusty and stale. Summer had gotten old. Everyone was counting the days until fall brought cooling breezes and the relief of steady rain. Would Jake make it to fall? Margie groaned and rocked the porch swing faster. Her days were getting harder. Not only was Jake's double vision becoming more intense, his headaches were worsening too. Increases in painkiller dosages made him weaker. His last 2 rounds of chemotherapy hit him hard. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Betterman had announced that the oncology team was stopping treatment. We don't have anything else, he told Margie after Jake's last round of chemo. All we could do is manage his symptoms. If he gets to be too much for you, we can move him to the hospice. He's not too much, Margie said. Dr. Betterman nodded and patted her hand. I understand. Did he? Margie wondered. She was just the nanny. She'd heard one of the nurses say that the previous week. Someone had asked the nurse if she was Jake's mom, and the nurse had said, No, the mom's dead. She's just the nanny. Sometimes Margie wished she was one of the robots Jake liked so much. Then she could be just the nanny. She'd have no bothersome feelings to deal with. But she wasn't just a nanny. She'd started that way, yes, but she lived with Jake for 3 years. She spent enough time with him that she knew him like a son, even back when he was well, before he became the invalid he refused to be. She'd come to love Evan too, not in any romantic way, more like a brother. When he was home on leave, he gave Margie the option to go on vacation, but she had no place she wanted to be for more than a few days. A couple of times, she'd gone home to visit her parents and some old friends while Evan was home. Gillian had even helped Evan out when Margie was away, but Margie wasn't gone long, so the 3 of them became like a little family, and she was included in the outings, the movie nights, the game nights, and the storytelling time. Then, of course, when Evan was overseas, she became Jake's whole world. And now, he was her whole world too. And even she couldn't muster enough positivity to convince herself her world was going to continue to spin on its axis. Margie's parents wanted her to come back home. You're going to be crushed when that boy dies. You should get out while you can, her dad said to her. Leave it to a retired Marine to excise the emotion from the equation. Like she could drop Jake's failing body in a hospice center, pack up her few things, leave, and forget she ever heard of a boy named Jake. Just the thought made her so angry she wanted to climb through the phone line and strangle her dad. What happened to leave no man behind, Dad? Why do you think I want you to get out? He said. I'm trying to bring you home whole. It's too late for that. Margie just had to deal with it, like she always had. But then the call came.